There are things that only age can give you permission to say. Not because the truth changes over time, but because the distance between who you were and who you become finally grows wide enough to look back without flinching. Sophia Loren has spent 9 decades accumulating that kind of distance. She has survived hunger and war, navigated a love story that scandalized a nation, won Hollywood's highest honor, and outlasted virtually everyone who ever shared a stage or screen with her. Now, at 91, she is speaking about things she has kept to herself for 60 years. And among those things is George Peppard, a man the world thought it understood, a man she watched more clearly than almost anyone else ever did, and a man whose story she has chosen finally to tell in full. Before you can understand what Sophia Loren's words about George Peppard carry with them, you have to understand the life behind the voice that is saying them. Sophia Villani Ciccalone was born on September 20th, 1934 in Rome, but grew up in Pozzuoli, a town near Naples, in conditions that the word poverty barely captures. Her father, Riccardo Ciccalone, never married her mother Romilda Villani and largely abandoned the family, leaving Romilda to raise Sophia and her younger sister Maria in a single room, in genuine destitution, in a region that would soon become a target of Allied bombing raids during the Second World War. Sophia has spoken in multiple documented interviews, including her authorized biography Sophia, Living and Loving, co-written with A. Hotchner and published by William Morrow, about what those years actually felt like from the inside. She described days without adequate food, clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric had almost disappeared, and particular terror of crouching in makeshift shelters during air raids while bombs fell close enough to shake the ground beneath them. She watched neighbors die. She saw buildings collapse. She learned, before she was old enough to fully understand it, that the world was not a safe place, and that survival required a particular kind of internal toughness that no amount of later prosperity could erase. These experiences are not incidental to who Sophia Loren became as an actress and as a person when she portrayed Caesira in Two Women in 1961, the performance that earned her the Academy Award for Best Actress, making her the first performer to win an Oscar for a role in a foreign language film. She was not summoning imagined suffering. She was drawing on memories that had never left her. Directors who worked with her during that era consistently noted something in her performances that was almost impossible to manufacture, an authenticity rooted in lived experience rather than craft alone. Vittorio De Sica, who directed her in Two Women and in several of her most acclaimed subsequent films, described her as someone who did not so much perform emotion as release it, as though the feeling were already present inside her and the camera simply caught it on the way out. By the time she encountered George Peppard in the early 1960s, she was already an established international star, freshly decorated with Hollywood's highest honor, and in the middle of a career that would define European cinema for decades. She had also navigated, with the man she would spend over 40 years loving, one of the most publicly complicated love stories of the century. Carlo Ponti entered Sophia's life when she was 15 years old, and he was 37, already an established and respected Italian film producer. She had entered a local beauty contest in Naples, urged by her mother, who had once harbored her own performing dreams before poverty extinguished them. Sophia did not win the contest, but Ponti saw something in her that transcended the competition's criteria. He saw intelligence, presence, and a quality he later described as a depth of soul that most people spend their entire lives searching for in another person. He offered her work in films and became, over the years that followed, her mentor, her protector, her advocate in an industry known for exploiting young women without connections or resources, and eventually the great love of her life. Their path to marriage was made difficult by Italian law and Catholic doctrine. Ponti was still married to his first wife, Giuliana Fiastri, and Italian courts of the 1950s offered virtually no route to divorce. They married by proxy in Mexico in 1957 under Mexican law, a legal maneuver that the Italian government refused to recognize and the Catholic Church openly condemned. They were forced to annul that marriage in 1962 to avoid bigamy charges. They eventually married for the second time in 1966 in Paris, after Ponti obtained French citizenship and was able to divorce Fiastri under French law. That second marriage was legally recognized and lasted until Ponti's death in 2007 at the age of 94. In her memoir and in decades of published interviews with outlets including The Guardian, Vanity Fair, and People magazine, Sophia has consistently credited Pawnee with two things above all others: believing in her when she had little reason to believe in herself, and protecting her from the predatory machinery of an industry that routinely used and discarded young women with exactly her profile: beautiful, ambitious, poor, and without family connections to shield her. He produced several of her most important films, fought for her creative interests in negotiations she was not yet experienced enough to conduct herself, and remained, through 40 years and every difficulty those years contained, someone she has described as irreplaceable. His death left a grief that she has never fully resolved and does not pretend to have resolved. It is that understanding of love, hard-won, tested, ultimately durable, that gives her perspective on George Peppard's particular weight. She watched what happens when a person cannot build that kind of foundation. The early 1960s were the apex of both their careers. Sophia was receiving the Oscar for Two Women in the spring of 1962. George Peppard was riding the wave of the breakthrough that had established him almost overnight as one of Hollywood's most promising new leading men. His performance as Paul Varjak opposite Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's, released in 1961, which turned him from a respected supporting player into a genuine star. He had good looks of the striking rather than merely decorative variety, and an intensity on screen that suggested depths worth exploring. Studios were eager to deploy him. The industry expected great things. They met at a dinner in Los Angeles, the kind of industry gathering that studios organized regularly during that era, assembling contracted talent for photographs and relationship building that might lead to future projects. Sophia describes that first encounter in terms that suggest it registered with more significance than she has previously let on publicly. She recalls George as initially quiet, almost withdrawn, watching the room with a quality she describes as calculation rather than curiosity, the alertness of someone who is constantly assessing where they stand relative to everyone else in space. When he spoke, she says, his voice carried a deliberate authority, the voice of someone who had spent years making himself heard and was not about to let a social situation reduce him to background. She observed, in that first meeting and in subsequent encounters at industry events over the years that followed, what she now describes as a central contradiction of George Peppard's character. He wanted, with an urgency she recognized from her own early life, to be taken seriously, to be seen as a genuine artist rather than a handsome face that studios could market and discard. He was not willing to perform charm on demand or to play what she calls the industry's game of strategic friendliness and strategic deference. He had opinions about creative direction, about the quality of scripts, about the kind of performances that actually meant something, and he was not good at concealing those opinions. Even when concealing them would have served his career better than expressing them. He would become visibly frustrated when scenes were not working as he had envisioned them, and that frustration, jaw clenched, movement sharp, was not something he had learned to manage or redirect. Sophia says she would sometimes try to deflect his intensity with humor. She would tell him, she recalls, that life is not a battlefield and art is not war. He would laugh, acknowledge the observation, and then return precisely the combative approach she was describing. The advice landed and then evaporated, because his approach to everything, to his career, to his relationships with studios, to fame itself, was fundamentally rooted in a need to fight for what he felt he deserved rather than accept what was given. What Sophia has kept private for 6 decades, and what she is choosing to speak about now, is not primarily about George Peppard's professional conflicts or his reputation for being difficult. Those facts have been documented in Hollywood history. What she remembers most vividly is something most people who worked with him never saw, or chose not to look for: the person he became between takes, when the camera stopped rolling and the pressure temporarily lifted. He loved to talk about books, she says, about history, about philosophy, about why people make the choices they make even when those choices are clearly self-destructive, about the relationship between integrity and success, and whether the two things were actually compatible in an industry built on the careful management of perception. These were not subjects that most actors of his era readily engaged with in social settings. Hollywood of the 1960s preferred performers who projected ease and charm, who kept intellectual seriousness as a private matter and brought accessibility to every public interaction. George Peppard could not do that. He could not pretend to be simpler than he was, and that inability which Sophia identifies as one of his most genuine qualities, cost him more than he ever fully understood while he was paying the price. According to documented Hollywood history and contemporaneous reporting, including profiles in Time magazine during his peak years and retrospective coverage in publications, including The Hollywood Reporter and Variety, Peppard's conflicts with studios over creative control were real and repeated throughout his career. He clashed with directors and producers on multiple productions. His reputation for being difficult preceded him into projects, narrowing the field of opportunities available to him at precisely the moments when his career needed expansion rather than contraction. The industry gradually moved its attention elsewhere, toward younger actors who offered similar qualities without the complications. Sophia acknowledges, with the directness of someone who has watched this pattern repeat across many careers over many decades, that she observed George's struggles with the demons that often visit people who cannot find an acceptable distance between what they are and what the world is asking them to be. She attributes these struggles not to weakness of character, but to an intensity of need, for truth, for recognition, for love expressed in terms he could accept, that could not be met by the sources available to him. He carried his roles with him, she says. He internalized conflicts and emotions until they ceased to be contained within the boundaries of performance and began bleeding into the actual texture of his life. When asked directly what she would want George Peppard to hear, if it were somehow possible to tell him, Sophia Loren's answer is immediate and without hesitation. She would tell him, she says, that he was wonderful, that his talent was sufficient, more than sufficient, that it did not require the constant proof and reproof he demanded of himself and of the industry around him. She would tell him that the recognition he pursued with such relentless energy was not worth the cost he paid in pursuit of it. And she pauses before adding, quietly, that he was a good man, even on the occasions when he could not believe that about himself. That final observation carries the weight of everything she has described, because what Sophia Loren has come to understand about George Peppard, and what she suggests he never fully understood about himself, is that his need for external validation was never going to be satisfied by the industry, because the real wound was not external. It was the inability to value himself independently of how others valued him, to accept that he was enough without the Oscar, without the legendary status, without the kind of enduring fame that his contemporaries Marlon Brando and Paul Newman achieved, and that he always felt just beyond his reach. She is careful to distinguish between the industry's treatment of him, which he regards as genuinely unjust, a failure to properly recognize and deploy a talent of real substance, and his own role in the story. Both things are true simultaneously. She suggests the industry failed him, and he made choices that accelerated the failure. Understanding that is not the same as assigning blame. It is simply seeing clearly. Sophia Loren has been asked about George Peppard before, over 60 years of interviews and public appearances. She has spoken of him politely, professionally, and briefly. The version of the story she is telling now, the one that includes the private conversations, the intellectual intensity, the internal contradiction, the sadness she felt watching the industry withdraw its attention from someone she believed deserved better, is new, not because of the fact of change, but because the distance between then and now has finally grown sufficient to allow her to describe them fully without feeling she is betraying something. At 91 years old, having buried her husband, raised her sons, and delivered some of the most powerful performances in the history of cinema, Sophia Loren has earned the right to speak without performing. What she says about George Peppard is not a revelation designed to rewrite history. It is an act of witness, one great survivor of the 20th century's most demanding cultural institution finally describing, clearly and completely, what she saw in someone who did not survive it as well. She concludes by placing the two of them in the context that she has always understood most instinctively. They came from different worlds, not just geographically or economically, but philosophically. Her poverty taught her that survival required adaptation, that knowing when to bend and when to hold firm was not weakness, but wisdom. His background taught him that compromise was defeat, that strength meant refusing to yield, that real respect was earned only by those who demanded it without exception. Those two philosophies are not equally equipped for the specific pressures of a career built in Hollywood. She knows that. She has always known it. And she suspects that somewhere beneath the armor he never took off, George Peppard knew it too. Sources: Sophia, living and loving A. Hotchner and Sophia Loren, William Morrow, 1979. The Guardian profile interviews with Sophia Loren, Vanity Fair. People magazine, Time magazine contemporaneous profiles of George Peppard, 1962 to 1965. The Hollywood Reporter retrospective coverage. Variety Archive. Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences official records. Best Actress 1962. IMDb verified filmography.